when the earth itself had nearly disappeared beneath endless waters. When the waters finally began to retreat, they did Kurma Avatar. When the earth forgot the flood. There are moments in the history of mankind that are remembered not because someone wrote them down upon palm leaves or carved them into stone, but because they became so deeply woven into the memory of civilization that every generation inherited them as though they had lived through them themselves. And among all those memories is the one which stands apart from every other, because it speaks of a time when the earth itself had nearly disappeared beneath endless waters, when mountains had become islands floating within an immeasurable ocean, when the sky reflected only the restless surface of the sea, and when the hopes of every living creature rested within a single boat guided through the darkness by a mysterious fish, whose identity the world would only understand much later. For that was the age of Matsya, the first great intervention through which life had been preserved so that the story of humanity might continue, and this story we have discussed in our previous video. Now, when the waters finally began to retreat, they did not vanish in a single day as though some unseen hand had simply pulled them away from the face of the earth, but they withdrew slowly and patiently until the peaks of forgotten mountains emerged once more beneath the warmth of the sun. Rivers rediscovered the paths they had abandoned ages before. Forests awakened from beneath layers of silt, and vast stretches of fertile land appeared where only waves had existed for generations, so that the children who were born in these years could scarcely believe that the stories told by their grandparents, who insisted that the valleys in which they now played had once lain hidden beneath an ocean without end. Upon this renewed earth, mankind began once again to build its future, raising villages beside rivers, cultivating fields whose richness astonished even the oldest among them, domesticating animals that wandered through the recovering forests, and gathering every evening around sacred fires where elders recounted the story of the great flood, so that no generation would forget how fragile civilization truly was. And yet, there's something deeply human about forgetting the very disasters that once shaped our destiny. Because as prosperity slowly returned and the memory of catastrophe became increasingly distant, men once again turned their attention towards the ambition that had always accompanied human existence. Some dreamed of discovering truth beyond the visible world, believing that the purpose of life could never be fulfilled merely through the accumulation of wealth or the conquest of kingdoms, while others looked upon the abundant earth that had been gifted to them after the flood, and declared that the gods had preserved humanity not so that it might abandon the world in search of invisible realities, but so that it might transform the world into a place of unimaginable prosperity through knowledge, courage, craftsmanship, and power. And although neither of these visions was born out of malice, each gradually began to look upon the other with growing suspicion, until what had once been two different ways of understanding life slowly hardened into two opposing civilizations. The first sought harmony with Rita, the eternal order that governed the movement of stars, the rhythm of the seasons, and the silent laws through which the universe sustains itself. And within their settlements, one could hear the chanting of the Vedas before sunrise, see sages teaching children beneath ancient trees, watch kings receiving counsel from ascetics who possessed neither wealth nor armies, yet commanded immense respect because wisdom was considered greater than power. And everywhere there existed the quiet conviction that no society could endure unless it first conquered greed, anger, and pride hidden beneath the human heart. The second civilization looked upon the same rising sun and reached a very different conclusion, for they believed that nature had entrusted mankind with extraordinary intelligence, not so that it might withdraw from the world, but so that it might reshape it according to its own vision. And therefore, their cities grew larger with every passing generation, their architecture became more magnificent, their ships crossed distant seas, and their artisans transformed stone into beauty and metal into instruments of astonishing precision, while their rulers proclaimed that true greatness belonged not to those who renounced the world, but to those who mastered it, because in their eyes, prosperity itself was the highest proof of human excellence. For many generations, these two worlds flourished apart from one another, separated not merely by distance but by the habits of thought that shaped every aspect of their lives, until the changing face of the earth itself brought them together, because the seas that had once divided them gradually shrank, mountains that had stood as barriers became roads for travelers, merchants began carrying goods between distant kingdoms, wandering sages entered unfamiliar lands, and with every new meeting, the certainty of one civilization encountered the certainty of another. And so that civilizations which began with curiosity often ended in disagreement. Disagreement slowly became distrust, and distrust prepared the ground upon which conflict would one day stand. It was an age unlike any other that had existed before, because never in the memory of mankind had two such powerful visions of life confronted one another so directly. And wherever thoughtful men gathered, the same discussions arose again and again and again, until they echoed through royal courts, forest hermitages, and bustling marketplaces alike. For one group insisted that a civilization devoted only to pleasure and material success would eventually consume itself beneath the weight of its own desires, while the other replied that a civilization devoted only to contemplation would leave behind neither cities nor sciences nor the means by which future generations might flourish. Each side strengthened its arguments, neither realized that truth itself had begun quietly slipping away from both. Among those who watched these developments with growing concern were the ancient rishis whose lives had been devoted to observing not merely the movements of kingdoms but the deeper currents that shaped the destiny of humanity itself. It is said that one evening, as the last light of the setting sun spread across the sky like molten gold, a young disciple approached his teacher and bowed before him with folded hand before saying, "Gurudev, if both these paths claim to serve mankind, why does their meeting give birth only to division?" The old sage remained silent for so long that the disciple wondered whether his question had gone unheard. Yet at last the venerable teacher lifted his eyes towards the distant horizon, where earth and sky seemed to embrace one another, and replied with a voice so calm that it resembled the gentle flow of a river. "Because, my son, every truth becomes dangerous the moment it forgets that it's only one part of the greater whole. And every civilization begins its decline not when it becomes weak, but when it becomes believing that it alone possesses the complete answer to the mystery of existence." The disciple contemplated those words in silence, while the evening breeze carried with it the fragrance of flowering trees. And though he did not understand the depth of his master's wisdom, the universe itself had already begun preparing to reveal its meaning, because the conflict growing within the hearts of men would soon demand a resolution that neither armies nor scholars nor kings could ever provide. And when humanity reached the point where both material brilliance and spiritual aspirations seemed incapable of existing together without destroying one another, the preservation of the universe, who had watched patiently through every age without haste or anxiety, because time itself moved according to his will, resolved that the moment had come for another avatar, not to destroy one side in favor of other, but to become the foundation upon which both might stand together without sinking beneath the weight of their own pride. The years passed as they always do, quietly enough that no man ever notices the great turning points of history while he is living through them, because those who stand in the midst of an age seldom realize that they are witnessing the birth of another. And thus the children who had inherited the earth after the great flood grew into mighty kings, celebrated sages, accomplished craftsmen, and fearless warriors, each believing that the future belonged to the ideals they cherished, while beneath the visible prosperity of their kingdoms there flowed another current altogether, unseen, like the deep waters beneath a calm sea, carrying with it doubts, ambitions, fears, and desires that no council of ministers nor assembly of scholars could fully understand. The civilization devoted to spiritual discipline looked upon the expanding cities with increasing unease, for wherever wealth accumulated, they saw vanity growing beside it like a creeping vine that slowly wrapped itself around the heart of a man, until a man forgot that every possession must one day be left behind. And therefore, the sages traveled tirelessly from village to village, reminding the people that the purpose of human birth could never be fulfilled merely by satisfying the senses, because the pleasures that delight the body today vanish tomorrow like dew beneath the morning sun, whereas the realization of the self accompanies the soul beyond the limits of death itself. Yet although their words carried the fragrance of truth, they often failed to touch those whose eyes were dazzled by the brilliance of worldly success. Meanwhile, the great kingdoms whose pride rested upon their prosperity became increasingly convinced that the ascetics misunderstood the very purpose of creation, for they would point towards magnificent irrigation canals that transformed barren fields into oceans of grain, towards bustling ports where merchants from distant lands exchanged treasures unknown to earlier generations towards schools where mathematics, astronomy, and architecture flourished with astonishing refinement. And they would ask whether all these achievements had not emerged from the intelligence bestowed upon mankind by the divine, insisting that if God had wished humanity to abandon the world entirely, then he would never have filled that world with such inexhaustible possibilities. And so each side continued speaking sincerely while listening only enough to prepare its next argument. As this division deepened, it began to influence not merely the thoughts of philosophers but the lives of ordinary people who found themselves pulled between two visions of existence. For a young prince who desired to govern wisely wondered whether greatness demanded renunciation or conquest. A merchant returning from prosperous voyages questioned whether his wealth was a blessing or a burden. A student who had mastered the Vedas looked with admiration upon the engineers capable of redirecting mighty rivers, while those same engineers secretly envied the peace that shone upon the faces of forest sages who possessed nothing and yet appeared richer than kings. Until the confusion spread so widely that even the wisest among men found it increasingly difficult to distinguish the path that elevated civilization and the path that merely inflated human pride. It was during this age of uncertainty that the greatest seers gathered together beneath the shelter of ancient trees whose roots had drunk from the earth long before the flood itself, and they reflected upon the strange condition into which mankind had entered, observing that truth had become fragmented because every group defended only that portion which served its own convictions, and one venerable rishi, whose beard flowed across his chest like a river of silver, spoke after a long silence, saying, when two men stand upon opposite banks of the same river, each believes that the other has lost his way, yet neither realizes that both are gazing upon the same water from different shores. Another sage raised his eyes and replied, then shall we ask one shore to swallow the other? The elder man smiled gently before answering, if one shore disappears, the river itself disappears with it. Those words settled upon the assembly like the first drops of rain before a great storm, because every sage present understood that the crisis before them could not be solved by victory, for the destruction of either vision would leave humanity incomplete, and if civilization abandoned the spirit, it would become powerful without compassion, while if it abandoned material existence, it would become virtuous without the strength required to protect virtue itself, so that the preservation of mankind demanded not the triumph of one path, but the reconciliation of both. Yet, how could such reconciliation be achieved when pride had already built invisible walls higher than any other fortress of stone? When scholars sought only to defeat one another in debate, when kings measured greatness through conquest, when ascetics dismissed prosperity as temptation, and when every heart had become convinced that surrendering even a fragment of its certainty amounted to defeat. For it is among the most difficult tasks in human life to persuade a man that truth may continue to exist even beyond the boundaries of his own understanding. As the sages contemplated this dilemma, they perceived through their meditation a profound reality that ordinary eyes could never behold, namely, that the conflict unfolding across the kingdom was merely the outer reflection of a struggle taking place within every individual soul. Because in every human heart there exists an ocean immeasurably vast, filled with noble aspirations, resting beside dangerous desires, courage beside fear, compassion beside selfishness, patience beside anger, and wisdom beside ignorance, that the world outside is forever becoming the mirror to the world within. And no civilization can ever become harmonious until the ocean hidden inside man himself has been churned. That realization emerged a vision unlike any other that had been conceived before, for they understood that the ancient image of the Samudra Manthana should not be regarded merely as a physical churning of a sea in search of a celestial treasure, but as a symbolic churning of the immeasurable ocean of human consciousness, through which every hidden quality, whether poisonous or divine, inevitably rises to the surface before true harmony can be established. And therefore, they began teaching the greatest treasures of existence could never be obtained without first accepting the labor, the conflict, the endurance required by the process of churning itself. Far beyond the sight of the sages and kings, Lord Vishnu observed this awakening with serene patience, for the time had finally arrived when humanity had begun asking not how one side may defeat the other, but how both might survive together without abandoning their deepest truths. And it was precisely at that sacred moment that the universe prepared for an avatar unlike any other that had come before it. Because this incarnation would not descend bearing celestial weapons to destroy an enemy, Nor would it arrive amidst the roar of battle to establish justice through force alone, but would instead reveal that the greatest strength in all creation belongs to the one which silently bears the weight of others without demanding recognition, just as the earth bears forests, mountains, and civilizations, while never asking to be praised for its patience. Long before the mountain would be lifted, before the serpent would be chosen, before the ocean would be churned, and before the treasures hidden within the existence revealed themselves one by one, destiny had already chosen the form through which lessons would enter the world. And that form was neither the swiftest creature nor the fiercest, neither the most beautiful nor the most terrifying, but one whose quiet endurance had always concealed a profound mystery. For the humble tortoise carried upon its back the very principle without which no lasting civilization could ever be built, since only that which remains steady beneath the immense weight can become the foundation upon which all others safely stand. Messengers were sent, and they travelled across kingdoms where rulers had not spoken to one another except through threats and displays of military strength, carrying invitation not to war but to deliberation. And although many kings received them with suspicion, while others laughed openly at the thought that ancient enemies might suddenly become companions in a common endeavor, there were still enough thoughtful rulers who recognized that the path upon which civilization had embarked could lead only towards exhaustion, because no kingdom, however prosperous, could flourish forever if every neighboring kingdom was treated as an adversary, and no philosophy, however profound, could illuminate the world if it refused to speak to those who differed from it. Thus it came to pass that an extraordinary assembly gathered unlike any the earth has witnessed before, where ascetics whose possessions consisted of little more than a staff in a water pot found themselves seated beside monarchs, adorned with crowns of gold, where scholars who had spent their lives studying the eternal truth of the Vedas conversed with master builders, whose knowledge of rivers, mountains, and stars had produced cities that astonished travelers from every direction, where seasoned warriors listened to an unexpected silence, while elderly sages spoke of patience instead of conquest, and where men who had once regarded one another with distrust now found themselves compelled by necessity to consider whether the future demanded cooperation greater than any they had imagined possible. For many days they debated the condition for mankind, and although their voices often rose in disagreement because convictions formed through generations do not disappear in a single conversation, each gradually came to realize that the other possessed a fragment of truth which could not honestly be denied, until at last one among the assembled elders rose to his feet and spoke soft words that settled upon every heart with remarkable force. If the ocean conceals treasures sufficient to enrich all mankind, he said, then let us churn the ocean together, because only that which belongs to no single kingdom can become the inheritance of every kingdom. For a few moments no one replied, because the proposal appeared at once impossible and irresistible, for everyone understood that the ocean represented the immeasurable reservoir from which all possibilities arise, the source within which lay hidden not merely wealth but knowledge, strength, beauty, healing, and prosperity itself. Yet no one could imagine how such an undertaking might actually be accomplished. Another elder then asked, if the ocean is to be churned, what shall serve as a churning rod? Silence returned. It was eventually broken by a sage whose gaze had remained fixed upon the distant mountains throughout the assembly. There's only one worthy of such a task, he replied quietly, Mandara. At the mention of that sacred mountain, every face turned instinctively towards the horizon where its lofty summit pierced the heavens. For Mandara was no ordinary peak standing among countless others, but a mountain whose immense height and unshakable mass had inspired reverence since time beyond memory, appearing to every traveler as though the earth herself had thrust one of her thoughts upward towards the sky, and therefore all agreed that no lesser mountain could endure the tremendous labor that lay ahead. Yet agreements gave birth almost immediately to another difficulty, because one ruler after other began calculating the enormity of what had just been proposed, and before long an experienced commander rose respectfully before the assembly and said, Revered ones, even if every kingdom joins the undertaking, how shall we move Mandara from the place where it has stood since the beginning of time? For no army possesses such strength, and no engineering known to mankind has ever attempted such a feat. His questions spread through the gathering like cold wind, because every person present realized that they had conceived a magnificent vision without possessing the means to bring it into reality. The sages closed their eyes in contemplation while kings exchanged troubled glances, and for the first time they understood that the greatest obstacle standing before them was not disagreement but limitation itself. Because however noble their intentions might be, human strength remained painfully finite. The oldest among the rishis slowly opened his eyes and said, "Perhaps this is the lesson we were meant to learn before the work had even begun. For mankind often imagines that noble intentions alone are sufficient to transform the world. Yet even the purest intention requires a support greater than itself, because ideals without foundations collapse between their own weight just as surely as mountains collapse when the earth beneath them begins to give way." No sooner had those words been spoken than the atmosphere itself seemed to change. For a silence descended unlike the ordinary silence that follows conversation, carrying within it the unmistakable presence of something vast and immeasurable, before which every human voice naturally became still, and the sages who had spent their lives in meditation recognized that unseen currents had begun moving through the universe itself. Because whenever humanity reaches the limits of its own strength after sincerely exhausting every effort available to it, divine quietly steps forward, not to replace human endeavor but to complete it. It is said that in that sacred moment, every heart turned instinctively towards Lord Vishnu, not because anyone had seen him with ordinary eyes, but because every soul present suddenly perceived with astonishing clarity that there exists a sustaining power beneath all existence without which neither mountains nor oceans nor civilizations could remain standing even for an instant. And as this realization blossomed within them, they no longer regarded themselves as separate kingdoms pursuing individual ambition, but as participants in a cosmic undertaking whose success depended upon every hand accepting its share of the labor. Together they approached Mount Mandara, and with prayers upon their lips, determination in their hearts, and thousands upon thousands of willing hands pressing against its mighty slopes, they attempted to move the ancient mountain from its resting place, while the earth echoed beneath the effort of kings and commoners, sage and soldiers, craftsmen and merchants, striving towards with a unity the world had rarely witnessed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Mandar began to tremble as though awakening from a meditation that had lasted since the birth of the earth itself. A cry of astonishment rose from the multitude as the mountain shifted, and with renewed courage they continued their immense labor until Mandar finally left the place where it had stood there through uncounted ages, advancing gradually towards the great ocean whose immeasurable waters reflected both the heavens above and the uncertain hopes of those gathered upon its shores. None among them yet realized that moving the mountain would prove to be the easier task. For the greatest challenge was still waiting beneath the silent surface of the ocean, where the foundation upon which every great endeavor depends had not yet revealed itself. And before the treasures hidden within existence could ever emerge, humanity would first have to learn that no mountain, however sacred, can remain standing unless something stronger than the mountain itself slightly bears its weight. The shores of the great ocean had never witnessed such a gathering before. For every direction, kings had arrived from their armies, with their armies, sages and their disciples, craftsmen carrying the finest instruments their hands had ever fashioned, physicians, merchants, navigators, astrologers, and countless ordinary men and women who had traveled for weeks simply because they wished to witness an undertaking that future generations would either remember as mankind's greatest triumph or its greatest folly. And as the first rays of dawn spread across the waters, the immense silhouette of Mountain Mandar stood before the sea like a second horizon, casting a shadow so vast that hundreds of men could stand within it while the waves washed gently against its ancient stone, as though the ocean itself had paused to examine the visitor that had arrived upon its shores. For a long while, no one spoke, because there are moments when even the most eloquent among men discover that silence alone possesses sufficient dignity to honor what stands before them. And the only sound that reached the assembly was the ceaseless breathing of the ocean, whose tides had continued their eternal rhythm long before mankind had built its first village, and would continue long after the names of every king gathered there had disappeared into memory. At length, one of the younger rulers stepped forward, his face bright with confidence and the impatience of youth, and said, "We have taught the mountain. We have united kingdoms that had not stood together for generations, and we have gathered more strength than the world had ever known. Therefore, let's delay no longer. for surely nothing now remains beyond our reach. The old sage who had guided much of the assembly looked upon the young king with gentle affection rather than criticism, because he had once possessed the same certainty himself many decades earlier. And after allowing the silence to linger a little longer, he replied, "My son, the world has a curious habit of revealing its greatest lessons only after convincing us that we have already learnt everything worth knowing." The young king smiled politely, believing these words to be little more than the cautious reflections of old age, and with a gesture of his hand he ordered the great undertaking to begin. Thousands upon thousands of men surrounded Mount Mandara, while mighty ropes fashioned from the strongest fibers known to mankind were fastened around its towering slopes, and the drums echoed across the coastline and conch shells announced the beginning of the labor. Every shoulder strained, every muscle tightened, and every heart beat with the same determination until almost slowly, almost reluctantly, the colossal mountain advanced towards the waters, its immense weight causing the earth itself to tremble beneath every movement, while birds rose from nearby forests and frightened clouds and animals fled into the distance, as though nature sensed that something extraordinary had begun. The ocean accepted the mountain without resistance. The waters parted. The lower slopes disappeared beneath the waves, and the summit remained proudly visible beneath the morning sky. A murmur of relief spread through the gathered multitude. "It stands," someone whispered. "It stands," another replied with a smile. The young king turned triumphantly towards the old sage. "You see, Gurudev," he said, "perhaps we feared difficulties that existed only within our imagination." The old sage did not answer. His eyes remained fixed upon the waters. Then so gradually that no one noticed at first, the mountain moved. Not sideways, downwards. A single startled cry arose from somewhere within the crowd. "The mountain!" Hundreds of eyes turned towards Mandar. Its summit no longer appeared as high above the sea as it had only moments before. The water was climbing, or perhaps the mountain was sinking. Commands rang out immediately. "Pull harder, bring more men, secure the ropes." Thousands obeyed. The shoreline shook beneath the renewed effort, and yet the mountain continued to descend. Its lower slopes vanished. The middle disappeared. The summit that had towered proudly against the heavens only moments before now seemed strangely close to the restless surface of the sea. Panic spread more quickly than any army could march. If Mandar sinks, everything is lost. The ocean is swallowing it. The mountain is too heavy. The sea cannot bear its weight. The young king stared in disbelief. Only a short while earlier he had believed that the human determination could overcome every obstacle, and yet now all the strength gathered from countless kingdoms appeared utterly powerless before the silent depth of the ocean. And in the unfathomable depths of the cosmic ocean, the great Kurma slowly opened his eyes. For a few timeless moments, nothing appeared to happen upon the surface of the ocean. And yet, not every person gathered along its shore sensed that the silence surrounding them had somehow become alive. For there existed a silence both from the absence of sound, and there exists another that descends when the universe itself seemed to hold its breath in reverence before the unfolding of a divine mystery. And it was the second silence that now embraced the earth, causing the warriors who had never lowered their weapons to let their hands fall gently to their sides. Sages who had spent lifetimes in meditation to bow their heads instinctively, and kings whose commands had shaken entire kingdoms to stand speechless before an ocean that suddenly seemed infinite, greater than all ambitions of mankind. Far beneath those immeasurable waters, in depths where neither sunlight nor moonlight ever traveled, where the pressure of the ocean would have crushed every creature born to earth, and where darkness had remained undisturbed since the beginning of creation itself, there stirred a presence so ancient that the ocean did not resist it, but seemed instead to welcome it as a child welcomes the touch of its mother. And from those mysterious depths there slowly emerged the vast form of a divine tortoise. Not rising with the terrifying violence of a storm, not with the dazzling splendor that mortal minds often imagine whenever they think of miracles, but with the serene majesty of one who has never needed to announce his greatness, because all greatness already rests upon him. As his immense shell ascended through the waters, it appeared less like the body of a living creature than a fragment of the earth itself, awakening into consciousness. ancient beyond calculation and moving amidst the restless tides, carrying within its quiet strength a stability that no tempest could disturb. And those sages whose vision penetrated beyond the ordinary immediately understood that this was not merely another incarnation of Lord Vishnu, but the revelation of a principle without which neither kingdoms nor philosophies nor civilizations could survive. For the Lord had not come carrying weapons with which to defeat an enemy, but he had come offering his own back as the foundation upon which others might accomplish together what none could accomplish alone. The summit of Mount Mandara, now barely visible above the water, trembled, as though the mountain itself had surrendered every hope of remaining upright, and those standing upon the shore watched helplessly while the last rocky cliffs seemed ready to disappear forever beneath the sea, until suddenly the downward movement ceased so completely that it appeared as though time itself had forgotten to continue. And before anyone could understand what exactly had happened, the immense mountain slowly began rising once again. Not because thousands of men had become stronger than before, nor because the waters had somehow grown shallow, but because beneath the invisible depths something infinitely stronger had accepted the burden that humanity itself could not bear. While they spoke, the entire assembly watched as Mandara settled firmly upon the broad shell of the divine Kurma, no longer sinking, no longer trembling, but resting with perfect stability as though the mountain had finally discovered the place where it had always been meant to stand. And a great cry of relief rose from every shore as hope returned to hearts that had only moments before surrendered themselves to despair. Yet, Lord Vishnu uttered not a single word. He asks for no worship. He demanded no throne. He sought no recognition from those whose impossible task he had quietly made possible. Hidden beneath the ocean, unseen by almost every eye present, he simply continued bearing the unimaginable weight above him with effortless patience. And perhaps that silence itself became the greatest teaching of the entire avatar, because there exists no strength greater than the strength which serves without seeking applause, no leadership nobler than the leadership which enables others to succeed while remaining content to stay unnoticed, and no foundation more enduring than the one which never reminds the structure resting above it of the burden it willingly carries. Only now did the sages understood the profound symbolism that destiny had revealed before them, for the tortoise is unlike almost every other creature upon the earth, because it carries its own shelter wherever it travels, never depending upon changing circumstances for its security, withdrawing into itself whenever the outer world becomes turbulent, and emerging again only when the moment is right. And thus the Lord had chosen precisely this form to remind humanity that every lasting civilization must possess an inner stability independent of the storms that rage outside it. Because a society that derives its strength only from wealth, armies, or political power will inevitably collapse under those things when they disappear, whereas a civilization rooted in enduring principles can survive even the greatest upheavals of history. Standing upon that sacred shore, the young disciple who had once asked why two civilizations could not live together suddenly understood the answer that had eluded him for so long. And with folded hands he said to his teacher Gurudev, I believed that the purpose of this great undertaking was to obtain the treasure hidden beneath the ocean. Yet now I realize that before any treasure could emerge, the Lord first taught mankind how to bear one another. The sage placed his hand gently upon the disciple's shoulder. My child, he replied, that itself is the greatest treasure. For what value could Lakshmi possess if hearts remained divided by pride? What meaning could divine nectar hold if those who drank it had forgotten compassion? And what prosperity could endure if every generation insisted upon standing above others rather than supporting them from below? Because the churning of the ocean was never merely about discovering riches concealed beneath the waters, but about transforming the human heart until it became capable of receiving those riches without destroying itself through arrogance. Thus, before the serpent would be drawn, before poison would arise, before celestial treasures would appear one after another, and before the nectar of immortality would finally reveal itself, Lord Kurma had already completed the most essential part of his mission by demonstrating that every magnificent achievement rests upon unseen sacrifice, every enduring civilization rests upon quiet service, and every ascent towards greatness begins not at the summit but in the humble willingness to become the foundation upon which others may rest. Perhaps, my dearest gentle listener, This is why the sages remembered this avatar with such reverence, because whenever the world grows fascinated by those who stand in the light, Kurma gently reminds us to look beneath the surface, that history is not truly sustained by those who seek glory, but by those who silently bear the weight of the world without ever asking the world to remember their name.